Chapter 30, Act 30, The Autarch's Tale. Act 30, The Autarch's Tale, The Undying Flame. The sound of snapping bone resonated through the crystal chamber as Porum threw her head back and let out another blood-chilling scream. She had lost count of how many times she had done this now. Even so, her voice still had not given out, it only became laced with a fresh layer of pain each time. She could feel the hives swelling to life on her eyelids from the itchy wool of the scarf tied over her face, made more so agonizing by the fact that she could not move either of her arms or hands to claw at them. She was frozen in place by a hold spell, 4 of her 10 outstretched fingers now bent in grotesque directions. The click of steel against crystal echoed in her ears as she heard her tormentor take a lap around her paralyzed form. She could feel the malice rolling off his body in unrelenting waves. It was as if someone kept pushing her head in a tub of water and holding her there until the moment her lungs were about to burst, releasing her, and giving her only a moment to breathe before she was thrust back under once more. "Please stop, Kane." Porum regained control of her voice and hissed the words through clenched teeth and the throbbing ache of her hand. The footsteps paused. A shadow fell over her face. He was close, but not enough that she could feel his breath rushing over her skin. "Where is the crystal of water?" "I don't know. I keep telling you." "Indeed you do. And yet you keep expecting a different response to your foolishness." The footsteps started again. They were making their way toward the top half of her body. Her throat clenched in anticipation of what was to come. She could feel his fingers brushing over her pinky, lingering over the twin star rings. "Porum, where are you? I need you." "Kane, please." Crack. Ahhhhhhhhhh. A flash of white exploded in Porum's vision as the pain surged down her tendons. She felt her chin get yanked up as the scarf was ripped away from her eyes, her heart pounding in her ears as her eyes wildly darted about, still drowned in the piercing radiance of her agony. The face before her slowly came into focus, an ebony carving of twisted curves that made up a close-fitting helmet, slender spikes extending from behind his ears. A demon come to life from her darkest nightmares. "What?" Porum blinked drowsily. "That armor. I've seen it before." The voice inside the helmet laughed cruelly with just the hint of an aristocratic lilt. "Why do you keep calling me Kane?" He reached up, sliding open his visor. Porum's breath caught in her throat as she took in the luminous cerulean eyes burning into her. They instantaneously transformed her back into the terror-stricken girl that had once guided a knight of darkness through the realm of the undead, in search of seemingly futile redemption. "Cecil," Porum whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek as she helplessly watched his blood-stained fingers reach for her neck. A crash from the bed next to Porum startled her awake, shaking her free from the terror that had taken hold of her in her sleep. She choked out a gasp as her eyes popped open, her non-injured hand unwittingly flying to her neck to inspect it. In her haste, she dropped the 2 destroyed rings she had been clinging to in her sleep, cringing as she heard them bounce onto the floor. It was so dark that she could hardly see a thing, the lights had been extinguished, and it was clear from the portholes running along the walls that it was now night. She couldn't see any clouds flying by or any sign of movement. Perhaps they had found a place to set up camp. She had been out of it since she had heard Azaoi kicking Rydia and Edge out of the stateroom, ordering them to leave her in peace. She couldn't even remember her head hitting the pillow before the darkness had swallowed her. What a bizarre dream. Porum hesitantly planted one foot outside her bed, testing her strength. She could feel her ankle shaking threateningly just from that small effort, and feared for the worst if she actually attempted to stand up. Instead, she blindly slid her foot over the floor, hoping her toes would bump into the 2 rings. "I still can't believe it. The mysterious girl that attacked my Cydia is working for Baron? Working with Cecil? And now Kane too, it would seem." She quietly jumped in surprise as her foot brushed over ring number 1, curling it in her toes and slowly dragging it back toward her. When she bent over to grab it, she felt a shooting pain race up her spine, her head spinning wildly. "Ugh. I'm far weaker than I thought." She snatched the ring and pressed her palm to her forehead, taking long, shaking breaths to regain her composure. "Why does Baron, no, Cecil, seek the crystals? Theodore didn't seem to know anything was amiss, Does he have any idea what his father is trying to do? She spotted the second ring glinting from underneath the bed next to her. Her leg wasn't going to stretch over that far, she was going to have to either wait until the morning, or wake whoever had made such a racket next to her and ask for help. What the heck had happened, anyway? Her eyes better adjusted to the darkness now, Porum could see that one foot was jutting out of the blankets on the bed to her left, and they had most likely kicked a satchel that had been stashed at the end of the bed to the floor. The satchel was now half open, several potions and ethers scattered about, but thankfully not broken. Still, it would not be pleasant for whoever was sleeping to wake up in the morning and step on one of the bottles. Porum's eyebrows knitted in frustration as she made one last attempt to get up, her knees buckling before she could even lift herself completely from the bed. She was definitely not going anywhere. Hey! Porum whispered, cognizant of the fact that several other people could have been sleeping in the stateroom as well. Her mind had been spinning when she was first brought onto the Falcon, and she could barely recall how many strangers' faces greeted her at the time. Can you hear me? Your stuff went everywhere. The lump under the blanket grumbled, the stray foot retreating like a turtle hurrying back into its shell. Porum sighed, tapping the ring against her cheek. You're going to get hurt. Wake up. Please. The lump promptly rolled over, and Porum's heart stalled in her chest. Laying there in a mess of both tangled hair and robes was Porum, whom other than looking like he hadn't seen a night of sleep for days with the dark circles beneath his eyes and his slightly sunken cheeks, seemed somewhat okay. He was certainly breathing, and wily enough to cause destruction even in his sleep, which was all the assurance Porum needed to draw the conclusion that her twin would eventually recover himself. Porum pressed the ring to her lips, mumbling as she held back a happy sob. Had she the strength, she would have leapt out of bed and screamed for joy. Oh Porum! I'm so relieved. You're safe. Porum snorted into his pillow. Just you wait till I'm fully recovered. Once that happens, I'll... He burrowed deeper into the blanket, disappearing from sight a few moments later. Porum giggled into her hand, shaking her head. Nothing seems to get to you, does it, little brother? Maybe the elder was right. Perhaps that are some things that only you can teach. In the bed next to Palem's, Porum could just barely make out another figure stirring, a spill of blonde hair was splayed over the pillow, an innocuous sleeping face peeking out beneath a hooded collar that Porum didn't recognize. The young woman pressed her pale pink lips into a thin line, visibly flinching as she muttered in her sleep. Pa! Lom! Help me! Porum blinked in surprise, tilting her head as she slowly and painfully took on the endeavor of pulling herself back into bed. The spilled supplies and the other ring were going to have to wait, as anxious as neglecting both of them made her feel. Knowing Porum, he would just kick the satchel out of bed again anyway before morning's light. He had always been an aggressive sleeper. Besides, if he saw that she was literally losing sleep over a now broken, utterly obsolete trinket that he probably hadn't thought about in years, Porum knew she would never hear the end of it. She would discreetly ask whoever came to tend to her in the morning for their help in fetching the ring from underneath Palem's bed, and leave it at that. Taking one last glance at the woman, who had turned away and curled herself into a shaking ball, Porum sank back against her pillows, lifting her eyes to the ceiling as she gingerly pressed her wrapped hand to her stomach. I can sense a great power simmering in that girl's blood. On the deck of the Falcon, Rydia was slumped against one of the ship's railings, her head cradled in her arms and Edge's cape hanging from her shoulders. She had fallen asleep keeping a lookout for their next Eidolon, Ifrit. Edge was sitting next to her, propped up against a crate, staring at the specter of the massive moon hanging over the Falcon. He idly lifted his hand, flexing his fingers toward it. A few more inches, and he was convinced he could grab it in his hands. If only things were that easy, he could crush the thing to dust and then maybe some semblance of sanity would return to their planet once again. After they had gotten Porum and Leonora secured onto the Falcon, the question had been raised about their next destination. Unfortunately, neither of their new recruits were useful for any information in their depleted state, and it seemed all but a given at this point that the wind and fire crystals had already been spirited away by Baron. Edge could tell that, despite Rydia's 2 victories over Ramu and Shiva, she was drained from the disappointment of their being too late to save the earth and water crystals, and from not being able to stop the Eidolon's tyranny exacted on their friends. That was when Edge had made the executive decision to explore the Evelyn region next, if it could still be wandering about, and there would be no hopes dashed of a crystal to defend. Rydia had made no argument, and that was his final confirmation that she really was out of sorts. It had not taken long for them to fall back into old habits, and fighting was as natural between the two of them as breathing. She would argue with him about the sky being blue if he had irritated her enough. After Luca had taken them to Evelyn, Edge declared that they would lie in wait in the plains between the still sealed-off tower and the castle, where they could have the best vantage point of the comings and goings of the kingdom.
Master, shouldn't we return to the castle?
Zangetsu had asked in his usual patient, grandfatherly tone.
Surely the seneschal will be anxious to see you and get a status update, considering all that has occurred with the moon and the meteor storm. It's not necessary,
Edge waved his hand.
In the castle, it's more difficult to get a read on any of the tower's activity. From here, we can see everything. He must have gone against Seneschal's will when he ran off to the tower before,
Tsukinawa smirked.
And now he's afraid of the verbal beating he's going to get if he returns. I'm right, aren't I, Master? Don't be ridiculous,
Edge muttered.
What does Seneschal's will matter when it comes to his king? And your king too, in case you've forgotten. You're right on the mark,
Rydia chimed in dryly from her post at the bow of the ship, and the Evelyn IV tittered as Edge threw his hands in the air and stomped away. It had been at that point that Luca declared she was going to finally get some sleep, and she and the others made their way downstairs for the night. Edge had maintained a respectful distance from Rydia, although he couldn't stop his eyes from seeking her out during the chores he had volunteered to help Luca with on the ship. It had finally occurred to him that perhaps his party's dropping in on them, literally, might have somewhat been an inconvenience, and the princess looked as if she were about to keel over from rushing them around the world. He had decided that offering to help keep the ship up was the least he could do. He paused as he climbed the foremast to take a look at a tangled shroud, watching Rydia sink to her knees and pull her fountain of wavy hair over one shoulder, nonchalantly combing her fingers through the knots. Her eyes never left the pale blue desert spread before them. It's been 15 years, and you continue to only blossom more exquisitely, but your heart is heavier than ever before. I wish you would tell me what happened that makes you drift aimlessly through the beautiful planet you saved. Are you still in limbo between our world and the world of summoned monsters even after all this time? It was after he completed the final item on Luca's list that he noticed Rydia had fallen asleep, and had at last joined her, throwing his cape over her for warmth and allowing himself a short rest too. He had forgotten how much work it took to upkeep an airship. His time with the Falcon had been short when he had traveled with Cecil, but it had been exhilarating for Edge to learn that he loved to fly. In a different life, maybe if I had been born in Baron, I could have become an airship pilot. Maybe Cecil and I would have even served together in the Red Wings. If only Seneschal had not been so skittish about Evelyn embracing airship technology. Stodgy old miser. Maybe it's time to try again when all this is over? The glaring light of the moon made it impossible to sleep, and Edge was finding it hard to ignore the racing of his heart just from being so close to his daydream maiden. He wished he could read her desolate face buried under her tangled hair like he would the page of a book, and get caught up on everything that had transpired in her life since they had last parted that winter night in mist. He had heard the rumors over the years that Rydia had been spending less time in the Feymarch. His occasional clandestine drops in both Mist and the Feymarch, along with the chatter from their friends, had seemed to confirm that. But that had seemed odd to him, since he knew firsthand how much Rydia had loved it there. He wondered if something had happened, or if Rydia had finally found something, or someone, worth suffering in the overworld for. Not me, obviously. He lowered his head, pushing his hands through his hair and willing his eyes to slide shut, despite the insistent scorch of the moon's light. Once again, as he now found himself doing whenever he had a free moment to think, he tried to piece together the sordid tale that had unfolded for all of them these past few days, wondering what could have possibly spurred the mysterious girl into action after all this time, and what connection she had with Baron and the moon. And that bastard Kane is back as well. It's too much of a coincidence for my taste that he suddenly resurfaces when Baron is on a tier to gather the crystals. I've never been able to entirely trust him, but I thought up until the day he disappeared that he and Cecil were back on good terms again. But he told Porum he wants to kill Cecil. Does he see Cecil as a threat to the crystals, or is it something personal? If that witch was coming back for her revenge from 16 years ago, why couldn't she have come for me instead?
Oh my god! Edge, wake up! Quickly!
Edge felt his head loll back and forth violently as his eyes snapped open. Rydia was leaning over him, her eyes wild as she grasped his shoulders.
The castle. It's...
Edge twisted his body so that he could look over the ledge of the ship. He watched in horror as a pillar of flame leapt from the western tower of Eblin Castle, exploding into a plume of crimson smoke against the moon. A few moments later, another explosion rocked the castle, the eastern tower bursting into flames as well. Fiery debris sailed into the keep, and even from their position on the Falcon, Edge could hear the shouts of the alarmed soldiers awoken from what would have normally been another boring night of watch.
We need to go.
Edge jumped to his feet, pulling Rydia along with him. She wordlessly fastened Edge's cape around her shoulders, not questioning how it got there in the first place, bolting downstairs into the hull to get help as he ran to the control deck of the ship to lower the ramp. It's the same as 17 years ago? How could this possibly be happening again? But this time, Mom and Dad aren't here to save everyone. This time. Edge fled the ship and dashed across the sandy, dust-ridden plains to the castle gatehouse. He was greeted by a pair of ninjas who were hurriedly raising the portcullis in preparation for the onslaught of people starting to thunder down from the innards of the castle, and another ninja at the ready above to raise the bolt, holding the twin wooden doors shut.
Master!
One of the soldiers cried, giving a final yank on the draw rope that fastened the portcullis in place.
You're back. And safe.
The other soldier gasped, rushing to push open the doors once the bolt had been raised. Edge watched them scurry about with an almost mechanical indifference. He had to remain calm, he couldn't very well launch into a seneschal-approved fit and scare the hell out of everyone. Memories from Eblin's last disastrous fire flooded through him, he could already hear the screams of those burning reverberating in his skull and recall the crushing helplessness he had felt when he was knocked out by something, a monster, burning rebel. He still had no clue even today, and had awoken, alone, in Eblin Cave, neither of his parents by his side. I'm sorry, Prince Edge, your parents rushed back into the blaze to find some missing soldiers. And he had been too weak, too smoke-logged, and too foolish to follow them. He shook his head, banishing the past's foggy tendrils from seizing his mind.
I see the castle's on fire,
Edge offered the soldiers by way of greeting, and they exchanged a secret, weary look. He's as cool as ever. Even at a time like this.
It must be Ifrit.
A voice shrieked from behind. Edge turned to see Rydia running toward him, and behind her were Luca and the man in black, both looking about as well as you would expect for someone shaken out of a desperately needed slumber. Luca's bob was smashed on one side with her visor on backwards, and the bags under the man in black's incensed violet gaze could have held enough luggage for a cruise around the world. Giving himself a mental pat on the back for not immediately jumping to ignoble conclusions on why the stranger had felt the need to join them, Edge instead turned back to the soldiers, crossing his arms over his chest.
What has happened to throw Eblin into such chaos? Master, our intelligence is stymied at the moment,
the soldier from above called down to them.
Several areas of the castle are blocked off by impenetrable flame, which is keeping all but the most elite of our ninjas isolated to their respective quadrants. Those that have been able to bypass the flames by scaling the castle walls have shared that the fire appears to have started in both of the towers simultaneously. Those that are able are trying to get the citizenry out by unconventional means if they are in a quadrant that cannot access the castle gates. It sounds like the war all over again,
Edge frowned.
Those fires were caused by Rubiconte's monsters that gave birth to flame that became a living extension of their life force. The fires did not die until all the monsters were destroyed.
He peered at Rydia.
Could this really be Ifrit's work? I'm afraid so.
Rydia couldn't bear to look into his hardened gaze, and stared down at her boots instead.
It's possible Ifrit was drawn to Eblin away from the Tower of Babel because of the previous catastrophe. The smell of an inferno still lingers over this land, even 17 years after the fact. Ifrit can father monsters that have an affinity to fire called melt golems. They may be what are residing in the towers now. If we defeat them, will the fires retreat?
Luca asked, and Rydia nodded.
Yes, that should do it. Of course, if Ifrit is really stalking the castle, it may only be a matter of time before the fires renew. We won't let him get that far,
Edge growled, shoving past the soldiers.
We're going in. Master. Please, reconsider.
But of course, Edge would hear none of it. With Rydia, Luca, and the man in black running behind him, he first made his way to the inner ward of the castle, where he could see for himself the unkillable fire that raged across the stone bridge that would take you into the village and eventually, the throne room. As they ran, hordes of people pushed past them going in the opposite direction, all being led by soldiers helping them escape. Most of them paid Edge and the others no mind as they fled, terror having ceased their senses to the point where they did not even recognize that their king had returned.
What are we doing?
Luca huffed.
Shouldn't we be heading for the towers? There are a lot of people who may be taking refuge in the village that are now trapped.
Edge frowned. Including Seneschal.
Will magic truly not douse the flames?
He linked his thumbs together, index fingers pointed to the northern and southern poles.
Flood.
A barrage of tidal waves that rose from the ground at his feet and crashed into the fiery wall before them. The water burst into steam as it collided with the fire, not even making a dent in the inferno. Rydia stepped forward, closing her eyes as she folded her hands together.
Shiva. For the bindings of our covenant, I beseech you to come to my aid. Dispel the flames of war with diamond dust upon my command.
The ice fairy arrived at Rydia's side in a patina of dazzling light, pressing her fingers to her lips as she danced about the yard, her eyes darting in every direction as she sized up the situation before her. Finally, she returned to Rydia, her bell-like voice shaking as her feet tapped the flagstone.
Rydia, these flames cannot be quenched by my magic, this is the work of Ifrit's hellfire. Not even is my eyes powerful enough to overcome such ferocity, you need to call upon Leviathan's tidal waves or the All-Father's obliterating mega flare. But...
Rydia lowered her hands, her eyes consumed by the spill of the flames before them.
Neither of them comes when I call any longer. Can't you at least try? This place is teeming with humans that are panicked and afraid,
Shiva murmured, reaching down to stroke Rydia's cheek. As she did so, a pearlescent sheen of frost crawled up Rydia's jaw.
My diamond dust will not discriminate between man and flame. Although I cannot stop the flames, I can create bridges of ice and guide the others out that are trapped. Is that acceptable? Yes, yes.
Edge cried, falling to his knees before Shiva.
Please, I beg of you, save as many of my people as you can. We'll take care of the fire ourselves.
Shiva looked between Rydia and Edge, nodding.
I'll do my best, friend of Rydia, ahhhhh.
A figure suddenly leapt from behind the wall of flames, pouncing on Shiva and sending her rolling into the yard. Rydia and Luca screamed as they stumbled out of the way, Edge and the man in black simultaneously withdrawing their blades. A Jinn with crimson flesh and curling black ivory horns sprouting from his temples slammed his claws into Shiva's shrinking form as she deftly blocked each blow with a manifested sheet of ice, her legs kicking fiercely beneath him to try to free herself.
Ifrit!
Rydia cried, starting to run for him. Luca grabbed her arm, shaking her head.
Girl, are you crazy? We gotta put out these fires before they spread any further. If we don't find Ifrit's demon offspring, the entire castle is going to burn to the ground. She's right,
Golbez said.
At this moment, we do not have the advantage, we'll never be able to impair him enough to wake him back up with all this fire surrounding us. Let's weaken his source of power first. But Shiva!
Rydia shrieked.
I can't leave her. Not when I just got her back. I'll keep him distracted, Rydia.
Shiva called, forming an ice cluster around her fist and using it to smack Ifrit in the jaw. The fire eidolon roared, rearing backward as she curled her legs back and gave him a violent kick in the stomach.
Go with your friends, they need you. Come on, Rydia,
Edge said gently, taking her arm.
She's right, your black magic blows my ninjutsu out of the water. Please, help me save Evelyn.
Rydia whirled around to face him, biting her lip. The rising smoke was starting to obscure her vision, but their eyes found each other instantaneously. She knew there was no way she could abandon this man, not after everything he had done for her, and that was just in the last 24 hours. The last time Evelyn had burned, she hadn't been able to do anything, she had not even known of its existence, had never even the slightest idea that one of Evelyn's people would become someone so dear to her. But this time, she could change the tide of fate. Right?
I'm so sorry, of course, I'll help. Let's go.
With two black mages in their group, they quickly determined it was best to split up and take on the towers from which the fires had originated at the same time. Rydia and Edge turned left down an unfettered path to make their way to the western tower, and Luca and the man in black turned right to reach the eastern tower. As they climbed, Edge cleared their path of the lesser beasts that had manifested from the flames, flamehounds, and bombs, mostly, while Rydia made a sweep for any trapped citizens. Luckily, it seemed that the soldiers had made quick work of clearing the tower once the explosions went off and had escorted everyone out. At the top of the tower, Edge kicked open the door to the only room, letting out a menacing growl as a billow of black smoke engulfed them.
Hack!
Rydia coughed, pulling Edge's cowl over her face and narrowing her stinging eyes as she tried to peer over Edge's shoulder.
What do you see in there? I see a bastard of a golem using my magazine collection as kindling.
Edge shrieked as he marched inside, and Rydia could feel her teeth involuntarily grinding. You're kidding me. The room that had turned out to be Edge's bedchamber was glowing bright orange, the blown-out windows the only release for the layers of smoke and fire that were rapidly permeating the room. His curtains had been completely eaten away by the fire, leaving only bare, scorched metal rods drilled into the concrete walls. Crates of weaponry and armor that were scattered about had been toasted to ash, and the floor was now littered with black scraps where rugs had once lain out to combat the cold Eblanesa nights in the desert. Sitting on Edge's bed, which had become a collapsed throne of flame, was a mountain of molten rocks with glassy red eyes that had flames rising high enough from its dusty flesh to lick the ceiling. The beast lifted its head when Edge barged in, lifting an ignited beam of wood from the destroyed bed and aiming it for the intruders.
Blizzaga!
Rydia cried, an explosion of lotus-shaped ice crystals filling the chamber and throwing an unsuspecting Edge backward into his wardrobe. The sharpened petals of ice sliced through the melt golem as easily as a knife through butter, causing the beast to explode into a cloud of dust that scattered with the dissipating ice dust and snowflakes. The fire running rampant faded to oblivion, leaving Edge with a soaked, blackened, utterly destroyed bedroom. He lifted his head, shaking off his stupor as he leapt to his feet and made a beeline for his bed, which was now nothing but a heap of smoking wood and nauseous fumes emitting from his down mattress. After a few moments of tossing away rubble and hurriedly digging through mountains of ash, he let out a wail, shaking his head.
Gone. They're all. ARGH. 17 years of love and dedication blown away by an errant eidolon.
Rydia clenched her fists, her eyebrows shooting up high enough to touch the ceiling.
This is ridiculous,
she muttered. Her face was so red that she was afraid she would be the next object in the castle to burst into flames.
I'm going to find the others. Are you coming with me, or should I leave you to mourn? Oh, I'm coming.
Edge growled, rising to his feet.
Truly, this time that woman has gone too far.
Rydia smacked her palm against her forehead, retreating back down the tower stairs. I should have stayed with Shiva and let him deal with the melt golem himself. Luca and the man in black were waiting for them at the walkway that linked the central keep of the castle with the yard. With the defeat of the melt golems, the flames blocking their way had cleared, opening the path for more citizenry to flee. Luca was ushering people toward the gates as the man in black kept watch for any monsters eager to crawl out of the dying fires. Rydia was disturbed to see that both Shiva and Ifrit were gone, but there was little time to mull over where they could have disappeared to. Once the last wave of people had passed through safely, Edge ran ahead of them into the keep, calling out for any remaining survivors to flee for the gate. When they reached the village proper, several hiding soldiers came out at the sound of their king's voice.
Where is Seneschal?
Edge gasped, and one of the soldiers pointed down the hall.
He refused to leave until he knew all of the citizens had escaped, Your Highness. We secluded him in the throne room with a few guards, where he would be safest.
Edge nodded and sent them on their way, ensuring them he would take care of any monsters. Rydia caught up to him, grasping his arm.
What did they mean by that? Why would he be safest in the throne room?
Edge stared down at his feet.
It was fireproofed when the castle was rebuilt. After my parents.
Rydia released his arm as if it burned to the touch, her lip quivering.
Oh.
He threw open the throne room doors with far more force than was necessary, the sound of them crashing into the walls making the seneschal nearly leap out of his skin from where he was pacing in his usual path around the empty throne. A small group of ninjas were gathered in a corner, looking somewhat relieved that they hadn't just been ambushed by a pack of monsters, but rather just by their obnoxious king.
Your young highness!
Seneschal exclaimed, throwing his arms around Edge. Edge hugged him back tightly, silently thanking the gods that his oldest, dearest and most annoying companion was spared yet a second time from certain tragedy.
What's the damage report?
Edge asked, and Seneschal pulled away, reverting back to his all-business self. He cleared his throat, making it a point to eye Golbez warily. Even Rydia had to admit that among present company, the man in black actually looked like the person who would have started the fires, but Golbez took the Seneschal's suspicion in stride, merely turning his attention elsewhere in the room. He was used to it from Edge now, after all, no point in starting anything here and now.
The priority was to evacuate the women and children. However, I'm afraid our castle can't hold out for much longer, the fires have already done massive damage, and the soldiers reporting to me from the village say we can't seem to tame them on our own. What news have you, my liege? The monsters that started the fires are destroyed. The only people I found were soldiers in the village that were keeping guard. It would seem everyone else made it out safely.
Edge gave a half smile.
It's all thanks to the ninjas for getting everyone out so quickly, and Rydia's friends here.
He nodded toward Luca and the man in black.
The western tower is quite nearly gone though. And the east, I'm afraid,
Luca added.
It did not look like there was much that could be salvaged after we slew the Melt Golem holed up in there. And what of the Evelyn 4? They chased after you to the Tower of Babel. They're on standby at the Falcon for anyone that needs assistance,
Rydia said, quickly bowing.
I'm so glad you are safe, Seneschal. Ah, the Daydream Maiden returns to us once again,
Seneschal chuckled, and Edge shot him a glare, which he cheekily ignored.
I'm glad you are well too, Miss Rydia. I suppose I have you to thank for keeping His Highness in one piece. The Evelyn 4 have been doing most of the babysitting,
Rydia smiled weakly.
But we're still not out of the woods yet, we should get you out of here before.
Suddenly, the temperature of the room shot up to a blazing, unbearable heat that made Rydia feel as if she had plunged into a pool of lava. Whirling around, she saw Ifrit filling the threshold of the throne room, his claws tearing curling strips of bamboo off the floor as he pawed at the tiles. Thanks to the fireproof properties of the room, the flames continually leaping off of Ifrit's back were not catching on anything, but the chamber itself was not going to save any of the humans within when Ifrit decided to unleash a blast of his hellfire.
Here he comes.
Rydia gulped. To her surprise, Edge shoved the seneschal toward her, reaching to his belt to retrieve a shuriken.
Humph. Leave that guy to me. That's suicide.
Rydia hissed, and Edge glanced up at the skylights above his throne, arching a brow.
No. There's no other way. I'll lure him away from the exit. All of you, evacuate the castle in the meantime.
With that, Edge leapt to the top of his throne, perching momentarily to toss a timed explosive shuriken onto the skylight. A series of frantic beeps went off, and the glass shattered in a terrific explosion, sending a shower of dust and debris below. Ifrit watched Edge with interest as the ninja then took another flying leap, grasping the ledge of the skylight and shimmying out.
Edge!
Rydia cried, and Ifrit let out a roar, giving chase as he barreled through the throne room and launched himself upward with his hind legs, shattering the remaining glass pieces that were brazenly hanging on after Edge's explosion and forcing his massive body through the gap. Moments later, his battle-scarred haunches had disappeared, and a violent pounding could be heard on the roof above that made the entire throne room quake beneath.
You heard him,
the man in black muttered, pressing his hand both to Rydia and the seneschal's backs as he guided them out of the room. Rydia craned her neck toward the skylight as she was dragged away, but couldn't make out anything further. Luca followed close behind, along with the remaining soldiers, her axe raised just in case Ifrit decided to double back. Outside, Edge raced across the roof toward an eastern gallery that he knew would be likely to cause the least collateral damage to the castle as a whole if the tide of battle did not turn in his favor. He could hear Ifrit's claws tearing into the shingles behind him the entire way, but kept up his pace until he had reached the desired destination, skidding to a stop and turning to face the stalking Eidolon. Ifrit slowed his pace when he saw that Edge had stopped, rising to walk on his hind legs as he let out a guttural snarl, flames curling out of his lips.
Come on, Ifrit!
Edge shouted, withdrawing Masamune and Murasame from the holster on his back.
I'm not hiding from you anymore. Not this time. This isn't going to go down like it did in the Tower of Babel.
Ifrit inched ever closer, and Edge bent his knees, preparing to launch into his attack. He just needed the Eidolon to come a little closer, and then he could leap behind him and give him a nasty little surprise. If I can weaken Ifrit enough, Rydia won't be in any danger when she uses the light of her ruby to wake him up. Ramu and Shiva were too close a call, I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe so she can find the other Eidolons. Just as Edge was about to launch himself into the air, Ifrit sprung forward, pinning the ninja down before he could even leave the roof and sinking his claws into Edge's shoulders. Edge bellowed out a scream as he fell back against the sharp clay shingles, registering the spill of warmth soaking into his shinobi gear just as a whirlwind of blistering wildfire crashed down upon him from the blackened night sky. His vision became awash in blur of glimmering amber, the roar of the blood pulsing through his ears fading to a quiet babble as he felt his heart begin to strain with the effort of each new beat. For the moment, he was comfortably numb, but knew soon that his nerve endings would be tearing through his skin in an effort to escape the pyre that would ignite in his very marrow. So this is the end already? Rydia? Did you make it out? He closed his eyes, blocking out the pulsing amber light and surrendering himself to a tranquilizing emerald lull his imagination had scraped together with the last of his strength. He reached for it with his blistered hands, longing to feel the cool silk just once more between his fingers before he was spirited away to the next world.
Come, now. You call that skill?
Glossy tendrils evaporated through his fingers like smoke as another wave of seething heat washed over him. The sound of a leather cape snapping in the wind resonated in his ears like a raven's wings. When he opened his eyes, he saw Ruby Kent standing before him, a slash of a smile stretched across his blackened mouth.
You?
Edge growled, rising to his feet. Miraculously, nothing hurt. In fact, he felt better than he had in a long, long time. Murasame and Masamune were still gripped firmly in his hands. He leapt forward, bringing both blades down across Rubiconte's ruby-cloaked chest. They sliced through with no resistance, as if Edge had merely swung a stick in midair. The fiend's cloak didn't even ruffle. Ruby Kent chuckled, and Edge stepped back, hissing between clenched teeth.
Ruby Kent? What is this trickery?
Ruby Kent tilted his head.
So this is the man who managed to withstand my fire? Much has changed in 17 short years, it would seem. What?
Edge blinked, and a delicate hand touched his shoulder, sending a shiver down his spine despite the ungodly swelter that surrounded him.
Edge.
He turned to see Rydia by his side, her whip clutched in her hand. Behind her, a glimmer diamonds and snowflakes faded into nothingness. He strongly suspected she had been able to reunite with Shiva, and had asked the Eidolon for one more favor before dismissing her from battle.
Rydia.
He flushed slightly as he took her hand, reluctantly removing it from his body. He wasn't really sure he could form a cohesive sentence otherwise.
I told you to run.
She tilted her head, arching an eyebrow.
You expected me to listen.
Edge threw his head back and laughed, which seemed a totally asinine reaction, considering the ghost of one of Golbez's elemental archfiends had somehow magically materialized before him, but really, who cared about any of that when she was by his side? And now that he thought about it a little harder, he was probably a ghost himself, enjoying a short spell in limbo before ultimately being plunged into what was most likely a pit in hell with his name on it. He decided he may as well have fun with the bone the gods had tossed him while he could.
Heh. It's your funeral. That's the spirit.
Rydia smiled, cracking her whip as she turned to Ruby Kent. Ruby Kent greeted her with a sneer, wagging his finger.
What's the matter, Edge? Have you been defanged? Can you see him too?
Edge asked, and Rydia nodded.
Yes. I'm afraid so. What was it that you said when you crashed onto the Falcon? That history is repeating itself.
The two of them cast simultaneous Flood and Blizzaga spells, which Ruby Kent shrugged off with a swing of his infamous cloak of flame.
Is that all the spirit you've got? Stop playing games.
Edge growled.
Either tell me what you want, or get the hell out of my face and let me die in peace.
Ruby Kent laughed, raising his hands.
Yes, that's perfect. Now, recall it. That true E-flame which has been etched into you.
A maelstrom of fire encircled the two of them, forcing them to their knees as the suffocating heat drowned their senses and began to sap the energy from their bodies. Rydia gasped for breath as she struggled to lift her head, clawing at invisible ribbons of smoke that were wrapping around her throat. Edge's vision blurred into splotches of red and black, and the familiar feeling of his blood reaching a boiling point beneath his skin began to once again take hold. Any minute, he would surely burst out of his own blistering flesh. When he next opened his eyes, he found himself laying face up on the same roof where Ifrit had attacked him. The claw marks on his shoulders were gone, and in their place was a spill of Rydia's hair from where she had collapsed upon his chest. Her eyelids fluttered as she let out a low moan, her eyes meeting his as she blinked in confusion and pulled herself off of him.
What was that?
Edge muttered, pushing himself up by his elbows.
We both wouldn't be able to imagine the same thing, right?
Rydia gazed down at her hands, biting her lip.
Why would he appear now?
Below them, Ifrit was making quick work of the yard beneath the gallery, a new storm of flames erupting in his wake as he stalked back and forth, snorting angrily. He appeared to be disoriented and confused. He kept retreading the same path and flinging his head around as if he was not sure how he had gotten down there in the first place. Edge could see Rubiconte's smirking sneer in the depths of the flames, his stomach clenching as he recalled the Autarch of Flame's taunts. The true flame that has been etched into me? Would that be the rage you instilled when you murdered my parents? The rage you then called a weakness because I was a man that was a slave to his emotions, Because I had the audacity to love the family and kingdom you stole from me? He pressed his hand to his healed chest, frowning as his fingers caressed the unbroken skin through his clothes. Even so? This time? Were you actually trying to help me?
Ifrit!
Rydia cried, crawling forward and lowering her head. Her face was streaked with soot, the tears running down her cheeks tilling streaks of ghostly white in their wake.
No. The fire is spreading too fast. If we don't do something, the entire keep is going to go up in smoke.
The true flame. As he watched the panic ignite in Rydia's eyes, Edge gasped, snapping his fingers.
Wait. That's it. The blast from an explosion will quell the flames. An eye for an eye.
Rydia lifted her head, her chapped lower lip quivering.
So. Fire against fire. You got it.
Edge stood up, grinning.
When water and ice won't work, hit them with a taste of their own medicine.
She bit her lip.
This doesn't seem to add up. Are you sure we're not just going to make things worse? We might end up blowing Eblin off the map.
Edge grabbed her hands and pulled her to her feet, nodding.
I've never been sure. Think of it as like blowing out a candle, only we're, you know, like a giant, catastrophic version of that.
Rydia stared at their interwoven fingers, the corner of her mouth twitching slightly.
I guess I'll just have to trust you. Good, because I'm going to need your help. With your fire magic, and my flame ninjutsu, we're going to create an inferno of our own. That's what Ruby Kant was trying to show me.
How could I have not seen it earlier? My true flame is my friends, they're spirits that burn deep inside me, no matter how long we've been apart, guiding me even from afar. It was with our strength combined that we defeated Ruby Kant, and saved the world from Zeramus's malice. And I'll use that same strength to save Ifrit. And Cecil. Silently counting to 3, they leapt down from the gallery roof, tumbling onto a flagstone pathway that had not yet been taken by the fire. Ifrit turned to face them, his roar echoing in the night sky as another shot of flames exploded from his maw.
I'm ready for you now, Ifrit. Let's go.
Edge hissed, and turned to Rydia.
You're with me, right? Yes.
I have to trust Edge, he doesn't want to hurt Ifrit, either. I have to believe that this will really work. Rydia closed her eyes, exhaling slowly as she began to conjure a Firaga spell. Next to her, Edge was readying a flame ninjutsu, his eyes narrowed as his hands fluidly moved to each of the hand seals needed to cast the spell. As Ifrit sprang forward, Edge released his spell, directing a whirlwind of flames to encircle the eidolon like a cage and gritting his teeth as he willed the fire to hold its shape with all of his strength. Rydia's eyes snapped open, and the Firaga spell struck Ifrit from above in a blazing cyclone, swirling with Edge's fire ninjutsu and accumulating into a massive detonation that threw the two of them backwards into the gallery wall from the aftershock. A plume of smoke rose from the yard as the wildfire was blown away, and Ifrit collapsed in a heap on the scorched grass, his yellow eyes narrowing as he desperately plunged his claws into the dirt.
Surprised? You're not the only one who wields fire.
Edge choked, slumping against the wall with a half-laugh, half-groan. Rydia pressed her hand to her forehead, idly wondering if it was possible that she would ever see straight again. She felt like an hourglass that kept getting turned over and over. She tried to will her body to rise, but her legs refused to cooperate, like they had been disconnected from the rest of her in the blast, even though she could plainly see them tangled and bruised before her.
Wait a minute. You haven't forgotten about us, have you?
Luca and the man in black were racing toward them from the south, Luca digging frantically in her bag for medicine. Fishing out 2 potions, she tossed them to Rydia and Edge, who both miraculously managed to catch them and proceeded to toss them back with the ferocity of starving children at a banquet. Rydia could feel the stinging, but sweet taste of the potion traveling throughout her body, stirring her tired limbs awake from stasis.
Heh. Sorry about that.
Edge grinned, wiping his mouth as he tossed the empty bottle aside.
Good timing, though.
The man in black knelt down to haul Rydia up, who gratefully clung to his arm as she reached up to take hold of her hairpin. Stumbling forward, she held the hyacinth high in the air, the glimmering ruby petals catching on the moonlight and filling the courtyard with a sea of crimson. Ifrit growled in his throat as the light splashed over his eyes, his head slumping into his arms as the muscles in his broad back rippled.
Ridai. Ifrit. You're back.
Rydia exclaimed, throwing herself on top of him and laughing gleefully. Ifrit lifted his head, the normally stoic Eidolon giving Rydia one affirmative nuzzle before disappearing in a flash of green and yellow crystalline light. Rydia clutched the lingering motes of light against her chest as she closed her eyes, her body shaking with relief as the light slowly died on the hyacinth's petals.
Thank heavens you're back, Ifrit.
She heard the crunch of footsteps in the charred grass, and looked up to see Edge standing over her, his hand extended. She grasped his fingers and stood up, pushing her hairpin back in place before reaching up and giving him a fierce smack in his shoulder. Edge jumped and slapped her hand away, glaring.
What the hell was that for? Have you gone mad?
Rydia shrieked. She reached up, unfastening Edge's cape around her shoulders with one fluid motion and whipping it off before shoving it into his chest.
Challenging an Eidolon by yourself. Not by myself.
Edge snapped, his arms fumbling with the cape as Rydia, Luca, and Golbez simultaneously gave him a death stare. The castle grounds had fallen into an eerie silence with the roars of the fires snuffed out and the evacuation of all of the residents. Edge threw the cape back over his shoulders, turning his back to the others as he took one last look at the destruction that had fallen upon his home. He was already anticipating the screaming lecture Seneschal would unleash once Edge told him that they would depart Eblan by dawn's light. He hated to leave the cleanup of Ifrit's aftermath to his people, but there was no way he could quit his journey now, not when they were getting closer and closer to uncovering the truth behind Baron's allyship with the mysterious girl thanks to each Eidolon Rydia recovered. I hate to admit it, but you saved my life, Ruby Kent. You reminded me of where my true power comes from, where it has always come from, ever since the day you struck me down in the cave of Eblan. I suppose I never properly thanked you. Had you not been such a smug bastard about letting me live, I might have never met Cecil and Rydia. Now, it's my turn to save them. And I will do whatever it takes. Baron.
What's this?
Cecil grasped the hilt of Ragnarok, taking heed of Kane's lance lingering only inches away from his heart.
Do you seriously intend to cross swords with me?
Kane exhaled deeply, taking another step forward, which forced Cecil to back away toward his throne.
If you wish for it.
Theodore felt as if his blood had turned to ice water, watching the man that had saved his life advance upon the man who had given him life, the same piteous look flooding Kane's eyes that he had held before slaying the Dark Dragoon. Before Theodore realized what he was doing, he found himself gently resting Rosa on the floor and hastening to his feet, his outstretched hand grasping Kane's elbow.
Kane.
Kane refused to tear his eyes away from Cecil. Cecil peered over Kane's shoulder, his lips tugging into a smirk when he saw the young boy trembling before him.
And this is the man you've placed your trust in, Theodore? Over your own flesh and blood? Have you any idea the treachery he's committed not only against the throne, but the world itself?
Theodore's heart sank into the pit of his stomach, his hand slowly releasing his hold on Kane as he raised his chin, forcing himself to stare into his father's deadened gaze. I still can't feel it. My father's light. He's standing here before me, but there's nothing there at all. Ever since the day of the crash. The day that stupid moon returned.
Stay behind me, Theodore,
Kane ordered.
Theodore.
Cecil's voice dropped to a low growl that sent shivers down the boy's spine and made alarms clang in his head. He didn't think he had ever heard his father use that kind of tone, even at his angriest.
I await your answer.
Theodore's throat clenched as he struggled to banish the tears building in his eyes. Their blurring veil was transforming Cecil into a towering shadow of silver and obsidian.
I may not know all of Kane's trespasses, but I do know all of his virtue, because of the stories you and Mother have told me, and because of what I've witnessed for myself.
He swallowed what felt like a ball of razor blades, his heart hammering in his chest.
I've only come to realize it now, but the moment I met Kane, I trusted him with my very life, because he reminded me of how you used to be.
Cecil suddenly withdrew his crystal blade in a blinding flash of light, a roar of wind tearing through the throne room as he leapt for Theodore. The prince stood frozen in place, the distant wail of his name from someone, his mother, maybe? Penetrating the throb of the blood rushing to his ears. An explosion of rainbow prisms burst in his vision as Kane swung his lance to meet Cecil's blade, the force of the impact tossing Cecil backward into his throne. Ragnarok clattered to the floor, the pillar of light that had briefly illuminated the blade fading to dusk.
Cecil.
Kane growled, tossing his lance to the floor and throwing himself on top of Cecil to pin him. Theodore shrieked as a pair of arms wrapped around him from behind, pulling him into a shaking embrace wrenched with sobbing. It was only when the curtain of golden hair fell over him that he realized it was his mother, finally allowing his legs to falter so that he could sink into her warmth. Kane slammed Cecil's shoulders into the throne's backrest, his thighs pinning Cecil's waist to the seat as he grabbed Cecil's jaw and forced him to look up into the dim candlelight that surrounded them. Cecil simply smiled, his eyes flashing as the Amazonite and pearls laced in his hair clinked against each other.
What's wrong, Kane? Are you being serious?
Kane desperately searched his friend's face for anything that would prove that this Cecil was a ruse, a fake, yet another imposter. His eyes kept returning to Cecil's darkened gaze, swearing he could still see a glimmer of that inimitable crystal blue in their depths. He leaned in closer, his ponytail sliding over his shoulder, when he felt a sudden spasm of pain lurch in his stomach. He looked down, almost disbelieving, when he saw Cecil's ivory fingers wrapped around a fast-fading crystal, the pointed end buried in Kane's abdomen and dripping with blood. The crystal dissipated into a haze of glittering light, the mysterious girl quietly lowering her hand from where she was standing behind them.
Cecil!
Kane moaned, clenching the wound with one hand as he tried to push himself up with the other, his lungs seizing for the breath that had been knocked out of him. Cecil decided to lend some assistance by giving him a violent shove, pushing Kane backwards off of the throne and watching with a crooked smile as the dragoon helplessly fell down the stairs, a fresh spray of blood spouting between his fingers.
Everyone is still tuckered out,
Rydia reported as she emerged onto the Falcon's deck, tucking her hair behind her ears.
But as Aoi said, they were doing well, their bodies are just trying to heal after everything they have been through.
She looked away for a moment, sighing.
Ramu and Shiva didn't exactly go easy on them, hey. It's not your fault.
Luca shook her head.
So let's not start the feel sorry for ourselves bit, okay? All that matters is that they are safe now, and that they've got friends watching over them.
Rydia flushed, resting her hand on her hip.
It may not be my fault, but... We'll be in Fabul soon,
Edge called over his shoulder. Luca had finally relented and let him have a go at piloting the Falcon, mostly because she really just wanted to get another few hours of sleep before beginning what was likely to be another hellish day. Galactic storms, frozen kingdoms and good old-fashioned arson, what could possibly be waiting for them next? Rydia perked up at this announcement, running over to the railing of the ship so she could have a better view. It had been very strange to wake up that morning to no sun in the sky, and that dreaded moon was closer than ever. Fabul, another castle like Eblin's that had its village housed inside its fortress walls, was tucked in the lowlands between Mount Hobbs and another, smaller mountain range to the east. It was nearly entirely shrouded in shadow that morning, but Rydia could still make out the marks of several craters that had crashed into the continent as a result of the meteor storm.
I hope Yang has some sort of good news for us,
Rydia sighed.
I'm so anxious to see him, he must have some idea of what we can do about all of this.
Rydia, Edge, Luca, and the man in black were greeted at the castle gates by a pair of monks standing guard. Rydia had been able to see from her position on the deck the way they immediately stiffened when the Falcon made its landing, which she knew did not bode well in terms of her fantasy of this being a productive visit.
Who goes there?
One of the monks demanded as they made their way down the sloping hill, raising a brass knuckle-equipped hand.
Wait. I know them.
The other monk blinked, taking a step forward.
They're friends of the king. It's been a very long time,
Rydia called out, giving what she hoped was interpreted as a friendly wave. The monks couldn't help but beam back at her, returning her greeting.
Lady Rydia. And King Edge of Eblin. Why do I get second billing?
Edge pouted. Rydia jogged the rest of the way to the gatehouse, panting for breath by the time she reached the monks.
The situation with the moon has thrown the entire world into disarray. How have things been in Fabul? Is everyone doing okay?
The first monk scratched his head.
Well, it's just been one disaster after another these days. I fear our latest one is that the sylphs have been laying siege to our castle. What?
Rydia gasped.
The petrified fairies from the underworld.
Luca blinked.
Why would they be in Fabul?
The second monk shrugged.
The moon must be affecting them in some unfathomable way. We can't understand a thing they are saying, it's all just high-pitched gibberish.
Right on cue, a piercing shriek emitted from inside the castle gates, followed by the sound of pounding footsteps and a man's voice shouting,
"Go away. I don't know what you want."
Edge raised his eyebrows.
Seems to be that way.
The monk sighed.
They haven't actually harmed anyone, yet. If you get too close, they'll scream your head off and pull your hair or try to bite your face. But since they won't let us near them, and we can't understand what it is they want, we're at a stalemate. But enough of this. Please, come in, just don't look at them, and you'll be fine. My word,
Rydia muttered as they stepped inside. The courtyard was flooded with sylphs as far as the eye could see. They hovered in the air in a scourge of green transparent wings, and clung to the trees that twisted over the garden walls like locusts. She had never seen so many sylphs in one place in her entire life. Even in their home deep within the underworld, only a few dared to show their faces at one time to her. The shrieking was near unbearable to listen to, and before long, she found herself clapping her hands over her ears. It's like they've been driven into a frenzy. They're not giving off quite the same vibe that Ramu, Shiva, and Ifrit were when they were under the mysterious girl's control. There is still something not right about them, but I just can't put my finger on what it is. On her own, a sylph is fairly harmless, but if they come to their senses and banded together, they could do some serious damage to Fabul.
Is there anything you can do about this?
Edge asked over the screaming, and Rydia shook her head.
Sylphs normally take action as a cohesive unit. It's clear to me that whatever allows them to communicate with each other is on the fritz. I wouldn't be able to heal just one of them, I'd need to get them all at once. And in this type of environment, and with this many of them, that's impossible just using the ruby.
Darn, Luca frowned.
I guess that would have been too easy.
She swatted at a fairy that had come too close to her ear, the sylph hissing and baring her tiny white fangs in response. They made their way into the grand hall, everyone letting out an audible sigh of relief as the doors to the next cloister were shut behind them, finally drowning out the sylph's racket. Another pair of monks ushered them into the throne room, from which Sheila had been just about to exit. She nearly slammed into Rydia, blinking in surprise when she saw the emerald-haired girl materialize before her.
Sheila!
Rydia gasped, stumbling back.
Oh, Rydia!
Sheila exclaimed, throwing her arms around her and pulling her tightly into her chest. Rydia squirmed uncomfortably, her cheeks burning against Sheila's overfluffed pillow-like breasts. From behind Sheila, the Duke Consort appeared, pressing his palms together.
And here is Lord Edge, too. Like I'm an afterthought.
Edge muttered. Rydia finally managed to break free of Sheila's grip, taking a gulp of air.
Where is Yang?
Sheila sighed, glancing back at the Duke Consort before replying.
Away on business, sadly. You just nearly missed him. I haven't seen the princess around either.
Edge trailed off, and Sheila bit her lip. An uncomfortable silence followed, and finally, the Duke Consort shook his head, gently resting his hand on Sheila's shoulder.
The two of them boarded a ship headed for Baron.
Golbez crossed his arms over his chest. Well, that's the exact opposite of what we wanted to hear. Fantastic.
I'm afraid that's as much as we know for now.
The Chancellor piped up, although he was so short that no one could see him behind either Sheila or the Duke Consort. Sheila snorted, her cheeks flushing deep red.
What of it? I'm not worried about them. My husband is more than capable of protecting our daughter. Why, knowing him, I'm sure he's out there busting heads as we speak.
Edge crossed his arms over his chest.
No doubt, no doubt. The King of Fabul is a stout man indeed. Is that why he was sent to Baron? To bust heads, as you say.
Sheila flicked her gaze away, her eyes hardening.
Not exactly, but... An agent of Baron stole the wind crystal, and Yang had some questions. Ursula insisted on accompanying him. She did her best to defend the crystal, but she was outfoxed, I'm afraid. An agent of Baron.
Rydia bit her lip.
Was it a woman? Far from it,
Sheila huffed.
It was that turncoat Kane Highwind, came back for round 2, I suppose. If he hadn't played so dirty, Ursula would have handed him his broken spine, I can assure you of that. Kane was here too.
Rydia shook her head.
And he fought Ursula? But how could he have made it to Fabul so fast from Mysidia? So does that mean Mysidia's crystal has been taken too?
The Duke Consort sighed. Rydia needed not reply, as the look on her face had told him everything he had needed to know.
The Red Wings accompanied Kane. It was an all-out assault. Unfortunately, many were injured, but luckily, we had no casualties. What is worse, however, is that we haven't heard from Yang or Ursula since they left. We thought by now they would have at least sent word on a ship returning to our harbor that they had reached Baron, or some sort of messenger.
Of course, Rydia frowned. No wonder the monks looked so panicked when we touched down with an airship. As far as they are concerned, Baron has just committed an act of war, and Yang is walking right into the maw of the enemy. She could tell that Sheila was worried sick about her family. She was sure that was where the woman's sudden bout of defensiveness had sprung from. Under normal circumstances, Sheila would have insisted they stay for a home-cooked meal and spent hours trying to pry into all of their private business so that she had some fresh gossip, but right now, she was a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Rydia took hold of Sheila's hand.
We'll find Yang and Ursula, I promise you. We're heading to Baron ourselves anyway. Hold up.
Sheila sniffled, tugging her hand away and reaching around in her apron.
Yes.
Rydia blinked, and Sheila produced a small frying pan and a ladle, shoving them into Rydia's arms before she could protest.
I want you to have this pan. I have a feeling my husband needs it right now. As for Ursula, this is her favorite ladle to cook with when we make our supper together every midweek. Hopefully it makes her a little less homesick. She doesn't like to admit it, but she gets lonely sometimes when she travels, even to a place as familiar to her now as Baron.
Rydia stared at the two cooking instruments with a blank face, and Edge snickered.
What, no knife? You know, that would be a lot more useful in battle.
Sheila shrugged.
Sorry, but I'm all out of stock of my good knives. The boys around here sure love to use them for throwing practice. Anyway, I want all of you to be careful out there. I trust you'll know what to do with these if the time comes.
Rydia could feel the blood draining from her face. She's not seriously proposing we do that again? No, I must be delusional from lack of sleep.
What will you do about the fairies?
Luca asked, and Sheila shook her head.
I don't think there's much we can do, hun. They seem pretty content here for the time being. That's not the exact term I would use.
Rydia tapped her finger to her chin.
It's almost as if they are searching for something. I wish I could understand, but it's impossible to communicate with them in this state. The sylphs will come to no harm while they are here,
the Duke Consort offered.
You let us worry about them for now.
It had become obvious by the tension crackling in the air that Fabul had not much else to offer them and no desire to entertain guests for longer than needed with Yang and Ursula missing. The party said their farewells, and returned to the Falcon, disappointed and empty-handed save for the ominous treasure Sheila had bestowed upon Rydia. Not sure what else to do, Rydia tied each of the instruments to her belt using a leather strip for safekeeping.
Is this really okay, leaving the sylphs behind?
Edge asked, starting the ship's engine with Luca precariously hovering over his shoulder.
I'll need to come up with a plan to heal all of them at once.
Rydia frowned, collapsing on top of a crate and sighing.
The sylphs as a race are a strange breed. They're not exactly eidolons, but they're not human, either. They carry all the powers of an eidolon, but they refuse to live in the Fame Arch and be ruled by Azura and Leviathan or test the will of any summoners that wish to call them. The only reason they ever offered to help me during the war in the first place was because...
She trailed off, her voice dropping.
Was because of Yang. So if we find Yang, we may also find someone who can speak to the sylphs,
the man in black said, and Rydia nodded.
But we know Yang is not in Baron.
Edge shook his head.
At least, not the town, if he's in the castle with Cecil. And we can't get into the castle without all of the eidolon's powers.
Luca added.
Then we're in a conundrum, hey.
Rydia bit down on her lip as the Falcon's engines roared to life. Always, it seems, we take one step forward. And then 2 steps back. Baron. Edward and Sid raced to catch Kane before his body could hit the floor, each man securing one of Kane's shoulders with their weight as Kane dug his fingers yet deeper against the gaping wound, hissing through clenched teeth and throwing his head back.
Cecil, stop this.
Rosa cried as Cecil rose from his throne, bending down to retrieve his sword and making his way toward Kane to finish him off. Theodore jerked away from her, withdrawing his sword as he slid to a stop in front of Kane at the foot of the stairs, lowering himself into a defensive stance.
Stop. Now.
Theodore choked, and Cecil paused, his smile fading.
Theodore. I'll lower your sword, father.
Theodore ordered, a little louder this time. He could practically hear Biggs's ghost screaming in his ear, telling him to say it like he meant it. Instead of heeding Theodore's warning, Cecil took another step forward, his cheeks flushed as his lips twisted into an ugly sneer. It took everything in Theodore's power to not back away. He planted his heels deeper into the floor as a quiet act of rebellion.
Theodore. You dare point your sword at your own father? Theodore.
Rosa pressed her hands together, the horrifying realization suddenly dawning on her that she would need to be prepared to either cast a spell that would defend her son from her husband's blade, or one that would strike him down before he could make the attempt. Theodore glared up at Cecil, defiantly cocking his blade. He thought of the hooded man's, no, Kane's, final request of him aboard the Falcon before they had been thrust into this madness.
Above anything else, you must learn to trust your intuition.
My heart. It's telling me that this is wrong, screaming that Father's conquest of the crystals is not the way. Something has twisted him, defiled his thoughts, if this is the path that I am expected to follow as the Prince of Baron, as the heir to the Paladin. Then I shall blaze my own instead, that's what Kane taught me. Rosa had slipped beside Kane while Theodore distracted Cecil, pressing her palm to his torn flesh and hurriedly summoning a curative spell. Kane rose to his feet as the blessing of rainbow light washed over him, holding out his palm. The holy lance rematerialized in his grip as he slowly opened his eyes, taking in Theodore's slight form. The prince was the only thing keeping Cecil from diving forward and slitting his throat. This is why I didn't want to get you involved. The gods forgive me for yet another grievous sin.
Theodore.
Kane began, but Cecil raised his blade, a flash of cerulean reflecting in the crystal as Theodore silently locked his gaze on his father's beckoning weapon. Cecil took another step closer, but even still, Theodore did not move, despite the tremors that had overtaken him.
Answer me, my son.
Two faces were fading in and out Leonora's focus. Another wave of nausea gripped her stomach as she struggled to keep her eyelids from slamming shut like two iron-plated doors.
Are you okay? You were moaning in your sleep.
One of the faces had morphed into an elderly man with a white goatee. His warm, ebony stare was searching hers concernedly as his hand reached out and pressed something cool and soft to her forehead. She felt the invigorating chill electrify her facial muscles and sank back into her pillow. Something about his deliberate, but gentle touch reminded her of her maternal grandfather. He had passed right before the war had ignited from an unexpected illness, had been her first experience with death before the world had been suddenly doused in it.
It's Miss Leonora, right?
The other face spoke. By contrast, he was young, his face unlined in a burst of color, violet hair was hanging in his clear, earnest gaze, and Leonora wondered how he could possibly see what he was doing.
Yes,
Leonora choked out, her voice cracking. The violet-haired boy presented a glass of water, tipping it to her lips as she swallowed it back gratefully. She remembered these two now, their names had escaped her. If they had even told her in the first place, they had welcomed her and Palom onto the Falcon in Troya. There had been 4 of them, ninjas from Eblan that were followers of King Edge. When Leonora realized she had been in the presence of royalty, she had nearly passed out in shock. Palom had neglected to tell her that Edge, as the ninja had casually introduced himself, was actually King Edward Geraldine, and that Luca was Princess Luca of the underworld. She had been a dithering fool in front of some major VIPs, and Palom had acted like it was absolutely nothing. She had been expecting the dark, statuesque man in black to be some sort of royalty too. The truth was, he was the kind of person Leonora had expected the King of Eblan to resemble rather than the wiry, youthful silver-haired rogue, but Palom seemingly had no idea who he was.
It looks like you've developed just a touch of fever,
the elder man said.
Your body is fighting off something, best to just keep resting a while yet.
Leonora finished the water, her gaze flicking to the bed next to hers. The boy's eyes followed hers, and he smiled.
Are you worried about Palom? He's fine. Still sleeping. Good.
Leonora trailed off, her stomach clenching again. She gasped, her eyes watering as a blast of hot air burst in her lungs, and sank deeper into her bed.
Leonora.
The faces were fading to black again. Voices pulsing in and out of her ears like distant echoes over the horizon. She slid her hands to her scalding cheeks, the sound of shattering crystal on the crystal dais ringing over and over.
The fire crystal. It too, is afraid. Just like the crystal of earth. Hey, calm down.
Tsukinawa frowned, glancing up at Zangetsu. Zangetsu shook his head slowly.
Master and the others are at Damsayan right now. It will be okay, we just need to wait for them here. It's too late.
Leonora whispered, her eyes squeezing shut.
The crystals. All of them. They are drowning in darkness. A little too quiet, don't you think?
Edge put his arm out to stop Rydia and Luca from moving any closer past the castle gate. They looked at each other as the man in black glanced back at the falcon to make sure they weren't being followed. It was parked only a short distance away, the propellers still slowing down from when Edge had cut the engine. If Fabul had fallen to just one of Baron's ex-warriors, what did that mean for a kingdom like Damsayan that had a fraction of its might, but nevertheless held a crystal? If Baron executed another massacre in Damsayan to get the Crystal of Fire, there were none of Damsayan's usual desert winds that would normally tousle Rydia's waves whenever she graced Edward's doorstep, and without the light of the sun, the normally blistering late morning heat had taken on the guise of brisk twilight. As they had made their landing, Rydia thought she saw dark shadows overlaid in the northern keep where Edward's throne room was situated, but she couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light, or evidence of something more sinister. With the Crystal of Wind stolen, the planet's air currents are already fading away, the change happened so much faster than last time. Has the crystal already left our world? Rydia's heart was racing, her eyes darting everywhere for a sign of life, no matter how minuscule, but not even a torch had been left aflame.
There are people inside. I can feel it.
Luca whispered.
They've gotta be hiding.
A sudden scratching noise skittered over the air, and Rydia unwittingly gripped Edge's arm. Edge gulped, his cowl suddenly feeling a lot like someone was using it to suffocate him.
That didn't sound like a person,
the man in black frowned.
Let's go,
Rydia muttered, shakily releasing Edge and reaching for her whip.
It could be an Eidolon.
They opened the abandoned castle doors, letting themselves into the gatehouse. Rydia's eyes widened when she saw what had made the noise, a rust-colored mess of twitching, spider-like legs with prominent, pearl eyes that sat above a pair of glistening pincers. The creature was climbing its way into a flower bed, scratching the limestone frame carelessly as its pincers crunched around a bundle of flowers and promptly beheaded the blooms before its front legs shoved the remainder of the stems and leaves into its gaping, drooling mouth. In the left wing of the courtyard, an entire colony of the beasts were sleeping in a pile, their idle, glassy eyeballs still wide open but unseeing. To the right, yet more of them were scuttling around, turning their attentions to the new arrivals but not yet ready to divert their activities from the rotting desert Sahajan corpse one, or perhaps many, of them had dragged into the castle to feast upon.
Antlions!
Rydia gasped, and Luca swallowed a shaky gulp of air.
You know these monsters? Are they Eidolons? Yes. And no.
Rydia watched as another antlion slithered on the outer keep wall just a few feet above them, seemingly impervious to gravity as it clicked and snorted away, disappearing over the ledge.
Did they overrun the entire country while we were away?
Edge muttered, and Rydia turned to face the group.
Antlions are normally peaceful, docile animals, from what Edward has told me. Other than the one time Cecil and I encountered one to try to procure a sand pearl for Rosa, I've never heard of them harming people before. Edward's family has been guarding them for centuries. Normally, they live in a cavern to the east. I can't imagine why they would come to a populated area like this. It must be the moon, then,
Golbez frowned.
Like everything else on this planet, they've been driven mad by the invading lunar rays and the shift of the tides. Well, it's either us or them,
Edge sighed, withdrawing a dagger.
We can't have a repeat of what happened in Eglin.
Rydia grabbed his wrist, shaking her head frantically.
Wait. Rydia.
Edge yanked his hand back, to no avail.
Come on, let me go. Please spare their lives. They're not the ones at fault here.
Rydia glanced back at the sleeping pile to their left, biting her lip.
They're the same as the sylphs. Something beyond their control is driving them to act this way. Do you think a normally reclusive beast like this would want to be around so many people? Besides, if we kill all of the antlion population, there will be none left to create sand pearls to cure desert fever. Who knows how many people might suffer because of what we've done.
Edge sighed, lowering his hand to his waist. Rydia released him, and he reluctantly slid his dagger back into its sheath.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Rydia lowered her head, her hair falling over her face like a curtain.
Now, let's hurry for the throne room, perhaps Edward has taken refuge there, with the crystal.
The man in black took the lead, not even flinching as he stepped next to an antlion that was salivating and hissing at him above the door they needed to enter to reach the next chamber. He stared up at the antlion defiantly, his hand outstretched and inching closer to the latch. Just as his fingers brushed over the polished brass, a screaming blur of black rushed past his cheek, causing a fine lock of severed hair to flutter to the ground. With a twang, an iron arrow bounced into the ground at the man's feet, narrowly missing him by centimeters. He glanced up, eyes narrowed, at a pair of guards who had snuck onto a balcony above, each equipped with a bow and arrow trained upon him. "Stop!" Rydia cried, and one of the guards responded by turning his bow on her instead. She raised her hands into the air in surrender, trying to suppress the overwhelming urge to turn tail and flee.
"Who goes there?"
the guard aiming at Rydia demanded. The other drew his string taunt in warning, and Golbez reluctantly raised his hands along with her, grimacing.
"We heard you discussing the crystal of fire."
The other guard barked, and Luca blinked, looking around. They had been practically whispering as to not disturb the antlions. How in the world could they had possibly been heard?
"We mean no harm,"
Rydia cried, taking a step forward, wincing as she watched the arrow aimed at her lower from her head to her chest. A pair of precise, clicking footsteps rang out, and a new figure appeared between the soldiers, her hands clamping down on the soldier's shoulders. Her navy hair was pulled back into a severe bun, black-framed rectangular glasses sliding down her nose as she peered over the balcony's ledge in a billowing black coat that camouflaged her within the shadows plaguing the lightless castle.
"Hold your fire!"
she suddenly barked, and the two soldiers dropped their weapons in the blink of an eye. The woman stepped forward, crossing her arms over her chest, and Rydia and Golbez reluctantly lowered their hands.
"You are Rydia of Mist, yes?"
the woman asked, and Rydia nodded. "It's hard to tell in this darkness, but I think I know her." That regal tone.
"I am. And I believe you are."
"Harley," she replied, taking a long look at each of them as she spoke. Although it had been a while, she recognized most of them, Rydia of Mist, King Edge of Eblan, and Princess Luca of the Underworld. For the benefit of the stranger in black, she finally added,
"Royal Secretary to King Edward." "I thought so,"
Rydia smiled.
"You have accompanied Edward to Mist many times."
Edge decided to cut right to the chase. He had already had enough, and he hadn't even gotten the pleasure of being in the Damsien guard's crosshairs.
"Where is Edward?"
Harley pressed her lips together, reaching up to slide her glasses back in place.
"You really don't know what's happening." "If we did, would we be here in a pit of monsters, asking you?"
Edge frowned, and Harley tilted her head.
"I suppose not. I'll be down in a moment." "But the antlions?"
Luca protested. But it was too late. Harley had already disappeared, her two guards following her. A few minutes later, she emerged from the door Golbez had tried to enter, alone, arching a brow as she took in her surroundings.
"Ah, there's even more than just a few hours ago. They must be very distressed. I hope nothing has happened to their nest." "How come they're not attacking us?"
Rydia blinked, and Harley reached down, snapping a blade of long grass from one of the flower boxes and holding it up between two pinched fingers.
"From within the castle, one of our musicians is playing a tune on a high-frequency whistle that only certain types of creatures can hear. This song in particular is one the royal family used to play when they would hunt for sand pearls in the antlion's lair. Even though they are docile creatures, they can get overzealous when they feel their offspring is being threatened. That song is being transmitted outside by this plant. It's not something our human ears can pick up on, but it's the only thing keeping the antlions from succumbing completely to that moon's lunacy. We still have everyone hiding though, just in case."
"Whisperweed," Edge nodded.
"That's how you could hear us talking about the crystal." "That's right."
Harley flicked the grass away, shaking her head.
"I'm sorry for the lack of welcome on our part. It seems that the lines drawn between friend and foe have suddenly become quite obscured, and we have been left doubting. If you have come calling upon the crystal of fire, I'm afraid you are too late. It was taken by the Red Wings, and a dragoon I am told goes by the name of Highwind. A friend of King Cecil's, if I am remembering my history correctly." "So that's it?"
Rydia was shocked to feel tears sting her eyes as her throat choked on her words.
"All of the crystals really have been taken. Do you know where he went?" "King Edward chased him back to Baron. Cain abducted Queen Rosa when he stole the crystal,"
Harley looked away as Rydia's jaw hit the ground.
I wasn't there when it happened, I was a coward and stayed hidden away under Edward's orders. Queen Rosa and Master Sid had come to Damcyan seeking refuge, and I was supposed to keep her safe in anticipation of Baron's assault. By the time the soldiers found me after Kane attacked us, Edward had left for Baron. They told me he was joined by Master Sid, Prince Theodore, and a man they didn't recognize. What?
Rydia bit her lip, shaking her head.
Cecil's whole family was here, without him? Why? I can only speculate.
Harley frowned.
Rosa and Sid told us that Cecil had sent them away days ago, begging them not to return to Baron, and neither of them had any idea where Theodore was. The Queen was on the verge of a breakdown in her short time here. But when Edward and I visited Cecil the other day, he told us Rosa was sick and that Theodore was training. Cecil lied to you guys?
Luca gasped.
That makes no sense. How could he not know where they were if he was the one who sent them away? I wouldn't believe it myself had I not witnessed his treachery with my very eyes,
Harley muttered.
But I overheard King Cecil's plans to assault Damcyan and take the crystal, and you can see the follow-through for yourselves in our now decimated throne room. Edward was hurt badly in the attack, but still, he followed after that madman dragoon to try to save Rosa, and the crystal, from Baron's clutches. And we all know the mess that Baron's been in since then.
Ed shook his head.
Who knows what could have happened to them? We can't even get near the castle, it's being protected by a magic shield. If Edward and the others are inside, there's no escaping for them now.
Golbez crossed his arms, gazing down at his feet. Brother? Why? Before, we could only hypothesize. But this girl's account seems to confirm firsthand what we've all secretly feared. Harley snorted under her breath.
King Edward isn't someone who would fall into the enemy's hands so easily. And with Prince Theodore and Sid at his side, I'm sure there is only a greater chance for their success. Why you rewrite?
Rydia smiled weakly.
It's not over yet, maybe they'll talk some sense into Cecil and take the crystals back. Of course I'm right.
Harley reached into her coat pocket, withdrawing a pair of black leather fingerless gloves and elegantly sliding them over her hands.
You're trying to find a way into Baron, right? I'll be coming with you.
Edge barked out a sarcastic laugh.
I'd reconsider that. This isn't exactly state clerical work here. Have you any idea what we've been battling against these past few days?
He waved a hand over the antlion-littered courtyard.
This isn't even close to the craziest thing we've seen since that moon came around.
Harley wrinkled her nose.
I may not be a warrior, but I have other ways of being useful. I would like to formally request she join you as well, sir.
The doors opened behind Harley, and Damcyan's chancellor stepped outside, much to everyone's surprise. Harley whirled around, a flush crawling over her cheeks.
What?
The chancellor folded his hands together, shaking his head.
There is no one in the world who cares more for our lord than you, Harley. Damcyan does need you. But I think King Edward needs you more still. I know you think he abandoned you, but that simply isn't the case. I think you'll understand if you go along and see for yourself what he is trying to accomplish. Erg.
Harley reddened deeper.
What His Highness does or doesn't do is none of my concern. I wish only to be of aid in returning the crystal of fire to her place.
Oh my gods, she's in love with Edward. Rydia's eyes widened, her heart fluttering at just the sight of the normally cool as a cucumber Harley's sudden bout of dithering. How could I have never noticed before? She smiled encouragingly at Edge, who blushed a little himself and rubbed the back of his head. Stoic, all business Harley he could handle, love-starved maiden Harley made him feel as if he had stepped into an alternate dimension.
Be that as it may, I can't just bring a mere secretary into full-on battle. You can come with us, but only until we meet with Edward again, okay? Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Harley exclaimed, clapping her hands together.
You won't regret it. We will guard King Edward's castle with all of our forces.
The Chancellor swept into a bow.
Our Lord's fate, we will leave in your hands. Don't worry about us while you are away, just focus on bringing King Edward home. We'll take good care of Harley and Edward.
Luca smiled up at Harley.
You can stay inside the Falcon until we track him down. I'm sure your advice will prove invaluable. I'm glad you think so.
Harley lifted her head, all traces of the giddy woman from just moments before suddenly gone.
So, what's the plan to get into Baron?
Rydia quickly explained the mission given to them in Mist to gather the Eidolons, and about her theory that she could borrow the Eidolons' power to break the spell keeping them locked out of the castle. Harley nodded, not interrupting with any commentary until Rydia had finished.
This all has to do with this new moon, doesn't it? I suspect so.
Rydia frowned.
I haven't been able to summon an Eidolon since its return. You said return. Does that mean you think it's the same moon as before?
Harley raised an eyebrow, and Rydia blinked, pressing her hand to her chest.
Well. Yes, I suppose that's what I've assumed this entire time. Do you think otherwise, Harley?
The secretary frowned, pressing her lips together as she peered over her shoulder at the looming orb on the horizon.
I've been thinking about it ever since Edward and I returned from Baron. I don't think it's the same moon at all. I don't think it belongs to the Lunarians, either, which then begs the question of what the connection is between this moon, the crystals, and Cecil, does it not?
She turned back around, and briefly, her eyes fell on Golbez. He could feel his heart leaping in his throat as she adjusted her glasses and mercifully turned her inquisitive gaze back to Rydia. She knows. She knows Cecil's relationship with the Lunarians. And she knows this is not our ancestors' moon. Rydia seemed as surprised as Golbez, not that she would have been able to tell had she seen Golbez's usual stone-faced reaction to Harley's hypothesis. Her own face had gone pale, and she could feel her fingers shaking as she clutched them into a white-knuckled fist.
But if the mysterious girl that has been helping Baron hunt the crystals is not a Lunarian, then just who exactly is she? Are there truly other moons that carry life like Cecil and Fusoya's moon? And why would they pursue the crystals as eagerly as Seamus once had? Why do tragedies from 17 years ago repeat themselves even now? I don't know any of that,
Harley said softly.
But it makes sense that this girl would arrive via that moon, no? Or perhaps more specifically, the meteor that fell between Damcyan and Fabul that King Cecil demanded we stay away from.
Golbez turned toward the moon, the blinding light forcing him to narrow his eyes as he drank it in along with Harley's dissertation. Another meteor, there's one on the blue planet too, just like the one eating away at the red moon. That was where we found her. Where she had risen from the ashes of our peaceful moon's destruction. On the lunar whale, while he had been hurtling toward the blue planet, the moon had seemed so massive. Now that he was this close to it, he felt as if he would be swallowed whole by its gravity at any moment. It would not do me any good to tell them what little I know right now, they would only get more suspicious, and we're so close to finding a way to break the spell keeping us from Cecil. We can't afford distractions, I'll deal none with my own hand. I can only silently concede that you are right, Rydia, she's no Lunarian. And I suspect, based on her apparent immortality, that she is far, far from human. End of chapter.